Hello and welcome to the fifth lecture in the GeoCurrents series on demography. Today's lecture is going to look at human population patterns and processes in the ancient Near East and Mediterranean world from about 3000 BC or BCE to 400 CE, or if you prefer AD. So I'll start with what is often called the dawn of civilization, some 5,000 years ago, because this is the first time we get the development of cities, states, and also literacy or writing systems. It's important to define what is meant by a state. That means an organized political community that is going to survive the life of leaders. In other words, there's going to be some sort of administrative apparatus that's developed, an incipient bureaucracy, if you will. Cities are large aggregations of population that are not simply large villages, a village being an aggregation of people who are engaged in agricultural work. And actually, in some of the early cities of southern Mesopotamia, a lot of people were probably doing agricultural work. But a real city is based on people doing non-agricultural work, administrative work, trade, making things, and so on. So this map, which I've borrowed from another source, shows four river valley civilizations, as they're called here, often viewed as the first or some of the first. Some recent evidence indicates, though, that in Peru, coastal areas of Peru, desert area where you have rivers coming out of the Andes Mountains, you had urbanization and perhaps states developing at about the same period of time. You didn't have literacy developing, so didn't have all the hallmarks of what we might call civilization. But these would be ancient Mesopotamia, the river area between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, largely in modern Iraq, ancient Egypt along the Nile River, the Indus Valley civilization, mostly in Pakistan, some in India, and civilization in North China and the North China Plain. That's showing much more than a river valley, and I would not describe this as a river valley civilization. Generally agreed that the oldest would be southern part of Mesopotamia, so Sumeria or Sumer, Egypt a little later, a little bit later for the Indus Valley. This map has China very early, but many scholars would say that it came somewhat later. I don't want to discuss those issues in any more detail. One theory for the development of states and civilization at the time in several different parts of the world is the circumscription theory associated with Robert Canero, who wrote, I think, the first paper on this topic in 1970, so quite a while ago. It's controversial. I certainly don't want to pretend that this is the reason why states and cities developed at this time, but it's an intriguing theory, and a number of people still follow it. And the basic idea is that population pressure in a limited environment, one that people could not simply leave, contributed to the development of states. So let's say you have a situation of an agricultural population. A population is growing, resulting in some stress and pressure. There's more competition. You start getting the development of elites who are struggling amongst themselves, hence warfare. As that continues, one group of elites might be able to gain power and then go on to create a state. The circumscription idea is really important, though, because what it means is this happened first in environments where people couldn't simply leave and get away from this. Because most people in early states may have had some benefits from the state organization, but they were also subjected to taxation. Their labor was often conscripted, corvée labor, for example, and they were subject to a variety of demands and obligations from the state elite, which is something that generally people are not going to be too happy about. So if you have an area of rain-fed agriculture, for example, especially a population pressure is lower away from these incipient state cores, people simply, many would have wanted to escape this domination and would have left. So the development of states then happened earliest in these conscripted environments, and then states became quite powerful, were able to expand, and that helped spread the state over most of the world. A lot of this is um, very open to interpretation, and I just want to explore some of the options. I also want to give an example of a possible state that failed because of this reason. Now, we don't know why Cahokia failed, but we do know that around 1350 CE or AD, there was a very large urban or proto-urban center in what is today Illinois, just across the Mississippi from St. Louis. Cahokia might have had 20 to 40,000 people. A highly developed political system is evident. There were large temples, a number of them, very sort of planned out streets and the like. Very extensive trade networks around it. And then 1,500 years later, it was essentially abandoned. And today, the large earth mounds on which the temple sat are still evident in the landscape, but this city, if you will, or proto-state collapsed. There may have been many reasons. It may have to do with environmental pressures. Who knows? But one interesting theory is that people simply got disgusted with the power of the elites there. They lost their legitimacy, and the exit option was taken. For an interesting book that suggests this, I would recommend David Graeber and David Wengrau's The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity. I think it was 2021. It was a major very well selling book at the time, very controversial, and I do not want to suggest that it is the correct interpretation. A lot of scholars think that there are big problems, a lot of cherry picking of the evidence, and interpretations that are uncertain are sort of taken as certain. So it's a problematic but interesting book. Both of the authors are what might be described as left-wing anarchists. By that I mean that they don't think the state is necessary for complex social organization. They think that people can do what is necessary through self-organization, mutual aid, and help. This is an idea that's been around a long time. Most scholars regard it as rather naive. I suppose I would too to some degree, but I still think it's an interesting book. Anyway, let's go to ancient Sumeria, as it's sometimes called, what is today southern Iraq between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where city-states started to develop around 3000 BCE, literacy, and all the hallmarks of civilization. I put a heavy red line around what was Sumer at the time, partly because I want to bring to your attention the fact that what is today far southern Iraq was part of the Persian Gulf at the time. So you have a lot of erosion from the highlands in what is now Turkey down through the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and the silt is deposited in the Persian Gulf, and so Persian Gulf has been filling up. Eventually it will entirely fill up. This is true of shallow waters where you have a lot of silt being deposited. Sumer is in a desert environment, so it is circumscribed at least partially. The original agriculture occurred to the north and to the west in this great crescent of the so-called Fertile Crescent, which I talked about in an earlier lecture. Agriculture there depended on the rain, winter rains, but Sumer is too dry for that. But instead, people started tapping the rivers, building canals. It's a lot of work. Probably happened because of population pressure. Otherwise it's much easier just to rely on the rain. Once you start building canals, you're doing a lot of investment. But anyway, that happened. It resulted in larger yields, at least at first, for a long time. That helped the development of villages turning into cities and becoming administrative centers, and hence the development of the state. And there are a number of Sumerian states. We got some pretty good population estimates based on archaeological excavations, essentially. And you can see on the list on the bottom right, populations from around 40 to 65,000. That doesn't seem like much by today's standards. Fairly small city of 50,000, but at the time, these were the big biggest cities in the world. And there may have been there are some very large agglomerations of population in areas in what is now Ukraine and Romania at about the same time, but they were not centers of states. They may have been relatively agricultural. They weren't true cities in this sense, anyway. The other point I want to make with this slide is that urbanization to some degree worked against population growth, in that demographers generally agree that ancient cities and even medieval cities, well, even cities into the early modern world, probably up to the 19th century, in general, did not reproduce their own populations. They relied on people coming in from the countryside. And they did not because of their relatively unhealthy environments with crowding, often with problems of water potability, being polluted by sewage and so on. Also, urban populations today have lower birth rates, and that's probably true in the ancient world to some extent as well. Later on, I'll look at that in terms of Rome. So, in ancient societies, medieval societies, and again, even into the early modern world, after 1500, urban populations were typically 10% would be relatively high figure, sometimes up to 15%, a couple percent more common. So most people lived in the healthier countryside. But anyway, back to Mesopotamia. There's pretty good information on the population, not just these cities, but of the whole region based on archaeology. A lot of work has been done in this region. Of course, it's still quite uncertain, but the general estimates are that, say, if we go back to 4000 BCE, this was before the real cities had developed, but starting to get pretty complex social organization, canal-based agriculture, and so on. Proto-urban is a term that might be used. The population of Mesopotamia may be 200,000. By 3000, when the states are developing, perhaps 1 million. 1,000 years later, up to 3 million. This was the final sort of glory days of Sumer. Sometimes called the third dynasty of Ur. After that, the center of power shifts north, and it shifts away from Sumerian-speaking peoples to people speaking languages in the Semitic family or subfamily, actually. Places like Babylon and the like. And Sumerian language ceases to be a language of everyday conversation and remains as a sacred language for some time. But then you'll note that another 1,000 years passes, 1000 BCE, population has declined, maybe extensively, 1 to 2 million. So it may have dropped from 3 million to 1 million, maybe from maybe a lesser drop, but certainly the archaeological consensus was there was a decline and a movement north, again, of power and population to Assyria in particular, which is in the northern part of Mesopotamia. I'll show you on a map later on. The most common explanation for this decline after 2000 BCE was salinization of the soil. So this is a problem in desert environments where you have agriculture based on taking water from rivers or actually from other sources and pouring it on your crops. The issue is that almost all fresh water has some salt in it. So you take water from, say, the Tigris River, put it in a canal, take it into your agricultural fields, and that water is going to have a little bit of salt. You pour the water, it evaporates, it picked up by the plant roots and transpires. So the water disappears, but the salt remains, and over time it will gradually build up, and that does seem to have happened. So in this abstract from this article, I've highlighted the text saying irrigation-induced salinity could have ultimately become a major constraint to settlement and agriculture in southern Mesopotamia. Most likely. And again, going back to our map, as I said, center of power shifts north to Assyria, which is in the Mesopotamian area, but it is outside of this desert zone. It's Mediterranean climate, much like interior California, and cropping of grain is based on sowing when the winter rains come and reaping in the spring when the crops ripen. Salinization is still a big problem today in arid environments. This Food and Agriculture Organization map is greatly exaggerated. All those red areas are showing us salinization, areas with salinization problems. You can see pretty much most of Iraq and many other areas. It's not a very good map. It's exaggerated, as is so common. Also, the gray areas are simply areas with no data, so you can see you can easily make out the boundaries of Uzbekistan, for example, or the boundary between Russia and Kazakhstan. And it has nothing to do with differences in salinization, just differences in data. But anyway, we turn to ancient Egypt, and there we see something very different. We might not expect it. So here's Egypt's an even drier environment than southern Iraq. Most of Egypt gets much of it gets less than an inch of rain a year. The far north gets a little bit more, but none of it gets enough rain for rain-fed agriculture. It depends entirely on the Nile River, except for a few oases in the Sahara. But yet Egypt seemed to have had, well, maybe not continual, but steady population growth. Here's a graph from the work of the geographer Karl Butzer. It's quite old. I don't know how well, but it seems to have held up pretty well. But showing a population of around 1 million when the first Egyptian state began in 3,100 BCE, as it's usually dated to, and by the year 0 up to about 5 million. Certainly, ancient writers in the Roman period thought that Egypt was the most densely populated place in the world that they knew, the Mediterranean world. Estimates are of about 7 million, and the one here you can see from Josephus was based on the revenue of a poll tax, so it may have been relatively accurate. Or here's some more modern estimates with the total population of Egypt going from 350,000, 4,000 BCE, and then you could see 1,000 years later, almost 900,000, 500 years later, 1.6, and going up and up and up. Interesting to look at Egypt today. This is just a view from space, and the green is the cultivated area, the agricultural zone, standing out in stark differentiation from the extremely dry desert around it. You can see the Nile Valley. You can see something called the Fayum Depression, which in ancient times was sometimes cultivated, sometimes not. Water drawn from the Egypt. Then you can see the large delta. In the earliest period, the delta was mostly uncultivated. Delta environments can be, generally are extremely fertile, but they are difficult to convert from natural ecosystems into farmland because you have ever-shifting water channels and waterlogging and swamps, and it takes a lot of labor. But that was one of the reasons why the population of Egypt was able to increase in the ancient period, was because the delta was progressively diked and drained and turned into farmland. A long process. Egypt today has 116 to 117 million. It has one of the largest effective population densities in the world. And what I mean by effective is looking at population in the areas where people actually live. And so most of Egypt is essentially uninhabited. The government wants to move people out, and you can see some recent irrigation projects in the far south using deep wells, I believe, to tap water from wetter geological periods. But that's quite different. So Egypt's population is extremely dense, and it's also growing. You can see the fertility rate 2.7. That's not super high, but it means a steadily growing population, 1.4% growth rate per year. So there's a lot of concern about Egypt in the future and its population. But back to the ancient world, the reason why Egypt did not have the problem of soil salinization resulting in population decline, unlike Iraq. And I should say, too, what is now Iraq, if you look at it through the Middle Ages, it seemed to have had the same pattern of population would increase, salinization would intensify, population would decline again. But with Egypt, you had a situation very different agricultural situation that did not depend on taking water out of the Nile and canals, but rather on the Nile's own annual flood. So in the summer of every year, there's intense rainfall in central Africa, particularly in the Ethiopian highland. That water comes down the Blue Nile, joins with the White Nile, and then eventually makes its way to Egypt. And the amount of water would be so much that the Nile would go out of its bounds, would flood its entire floodplain. Villages are placed at the edge of that floodplain so they wouldn't be inundated. And then by November, the Nile is receded, it's back in its channel, and you have waterlogged soil, a new layer of fertile silt, which means that fertilization was basically not necessary. That's waterlogged silt would be then planted to grain. The grain would grow during the relatively cool winter, just based on the water that was in the soil from the flood, and then would be harvested in the spring. So this meant there was no salinization. Any salinity would be washed out in that flood. Plus, as I mentioned before, you'd get the automatic fertilization. Now that meant that Egypt was able to support this very dense population, dense for the relative to the time we're talking about, and also export a huge amount of grain. Rome, when it was a city of 1 million, was basically fed by the grain supply from Egypt, which then was distributed as a dole to the population, which led to more population growth, at least in the early periods, because the bread was given for free, and that was the staple crop. If we move to the ill-fated Indus Valley civilization, we find something quite different. It's not even clear that the Indus Valley civilization was based on canal-based irrigation. There may have been a lot of more dependence on the monsoon rainfall. But we do know that this was a very sophisticated urban-based society. A lot of excavated cities and towns. The two big ones were Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro in today's Pakistan. This was also a totally forgotten civilization until people started excavating the mounds that they found, and they found that it had been very sophisticated cities, very well-planned cities, excellent delivery of water and taking away of sewage, so quite sophisticated. But it started to develop around 2600 BCE, a lot of trade with Mesopotamia, but it started to decline around 1900 BCE, and the cities were all abandoned around 1700 BCE. It used to be thought this happened because the pastoral nomads from Central Asia, speaking early Indo-European languages, moved into India, conquered the cities, and displaced them. That is not generally believed today. It's believed that those infiltrations of people from Central Asia, which almost certainly happened later. The cities had already been abandoned. It's interesting to note here that at the late point in Indus Valley civilization, excavation of bones show increase in interpersonal violence and infectious diseases like leprosy and tuberculosis. You can see signs of that in ancient bones. So it may have been population pressure, but that also was probably linked to climate. So evidence was fairly recently discovered of a mega drought lasting a couple hundred years, right about the time failure of the monsoons, which seems, we'll have to wait to see if this theory continues to be supported by new work, but it looks pretty strong right now. And this is important to note too, is how vulnerable human societies have always been to climatic fluctuations. Now, with concerns about climate change today, a lot of scholars argue that these fluctuations are becoming more intense. That's debated, but there's certainly some evidence that suggests that is happening. And we do know from many parts of the world that periods of drought or flood or cold have been associated with population declines, abandonment of cities, failure of states, and so on. I want to move on to another case of state collapse. This happened many times in the ancient world in different places and different times. They're very interesting examples. But the example I want to talk about now is the Bronze Age collapse, which happened about a little more than 100 years after the time of this map. So this map is showing the Bronze Age at sort of one of its high periods. It's called the Bronze Age because of the use of bronze, an alloy made of copper and tin, but bronze being the most important metal for weapons, both offensive and defensive, also for agricultural tools and other tools. Bronze is a hard metal, much harder than copper, for example, and was extremely important at the time. So anyway, this is showing the political situation in the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean at the time. We can see a number of these are states. So we can see Egypt, the new kingdom extending all the way up to what is now Lebanon, important source of resources for the Egyptian kingdom. The Egyptian states have always wanted to control that territory if they could, to get things like timber from the mountains of Lebanon. We can see in blue the Hittite Empire, very powerful empire based in what is now central Turkey. We can see the Assyrians. We can see something called Mitanni, Babylonian kingdom, several others. Mycenaean Greece was not one kingdom, but a number of city-states, as they're usually thought of as being. They weren't really cities. They had very well-built military citadels with very large stonework. The Mycenaean Greeks were illiterate. We know that they were speaking a form of Greek. Their script later disappeared. It was not the script that Greeks were later to use, and I'll talk about the reasons for that later on. But these different kingdoms and states interacted with each other. We actually have archival evidence from diplomatic letters exchanged between them at the time, as they were often at war with each other, but they're also trading and exchanging gifts and so on. So there's a lot of evidence about this. The bronze that they relied on militarily and to a certain extent, for agricultural and other tools, relied on extensive trade networks because copper and especially tin are widely distributed. So the map on the right actually shows, if you look carefully, you can see analyzed tin ingots and tin and other objects, and they can actually trace out where that tin came from. And a lot of it was coming from Cornwall in the south western part of England. And that was not would be considered a state, but there were these very well-developed trade networks that brought tin in. A lot of the copper came from the island of Cyprus. That's highlighted on the map in the image to the left. But at any rate, there was this spectacular collapse of these Bronze Age states. Eric Klein dates it to 1 year, 1177. It was often 1180 or so. The map shows cities that were sacked and destroyed. There were peoples moving in. Probably the most prominent were known as the Sea Peoples. They came by sea. Nobody knows where they came from. There are a lot of theories today. Very interesting. I won't take the time to talk about it. But you can see that in Egypt was able to withstand this, and its cities were not sacked, and its kingdom was not destroyed. But all those Mycenaean citadels were essentially all the sources in the Hittite Empire, most of them in the Eastern Mediterranean. Most of the cities simply did not survive, nor did the states. So, as Eric Klein says, the year civilization collapsed. A lot of debate about what caused it. There were these invasions. They may have been triggered by things like drought and climate change, volcanic eruptions, leading to a trade system collapse too. And as the trade system collapsed, the bronze and other trade goods that were needed by these powerful states and empires to maintain their political orders, they were gone, and the order collapsed. The trade goods often very important for political elites to distribute to their underlings to maintain their power and their systems. But anyway, there was this pretty spectacular system collapse, and almost certainly then followed by population decline. So again, ancient world and through the Middle Ages too, did not have in any one place, you did not have a situation where you had ever-rising population. You'd have population rise followed by sometimes plateau and sometimes by a real collapse. So some evidence that drought was the main culprit. We don't, this is far too early to say, that it was the reason, but this is just a recent article, 2023, looking at central Anatolia, what is today Turkey, where the Hittite Empire was, and evidence of just an extreme drought, which may have been a tipping point leading to the situation beginning to collapse. One other thing I should note about the collapse is there are surviving letters, usually preserved as clay tablets, from one ruler of one city to another, describing how their cities were being destroyed and their people slaughtered and the whole thing falling apart. So there's good evidence of this. Anyway, there was this general Bronze Age collapse. Like I say, not everywhere. Egypt didn't collapse. Assyria didn't really collapse either. But most places in the Eastern Mediterranean did, most states. By the year 1000 BCE, states are recovering and are beginning to expand again. This map has state-level societies in that sort of lilac purplish color. You can see it's not including Greece. Those Greek cities or citadels were not recovered or reestablished. Literacy was lost for Greece for about 500 years. This is something called the Greek Dark Ages, where what is now Greece went back to a much simpler form of social organization. But states did survive elsewhere. They began to expand. You could see even what is now Sudan, or Nubia as it's marked, was sort of within the civilizational ambit of ancient Egypt by this time. We're now into the Iron Age. Bronze has been replaced by iron. No one knows where iron working first originated, perhaps in the Caucasus Mountains between the Caspian and Black Seas or somewhere in thereabouts. But iron is superior to bronze in most regards. It makes better weapons. It's also doesn't require the same extensive trade networks because you just need iron ore, as long as you know how to refine it and smelt it. And iron deposits are very widespread and very common. So after 1000, we're in the so-called Iron Age. The map doesn't show civilizations or state societies as they're coding them here. It doesn't showing any in the Western Hemisphere, although a lot of scholars would suggest that they should be, particularly in the coastal parts of Peru. They're just showing here the Middle East and northern China. But these state-level societies are expanding. A couple hundred years later, you're going to start seeing states developing in northern India, an area here that's in orange as complex farming societies. So states and empire just being a very large state, or particularly a large state, whose rulers have conquered peoples speaking other languages, following other cultural systems, and then sort of ruling them as an overarching power center. There's something really, well, in terms of population, something quite ironic about these early states and empires. And the one thing, they were doing things that would enhance population growth. And then later on, I'll talk about how they were doing things that worked against that. I have here corresponding maps of the Roman Empire and the Han Empire of China, which existed at about the same time period. And the map on the left is labeled the Pax Romana, or Roman Peace. And on the right, we have what is Pax Sinica. That would translate from Latin as Chinese peace. Because large empires in particular brought peace and security within their boundaries. Not perfectly, but much more than before. So the Romans were very aggressive in expanding their empire, but as it reached its the boundaries that it had as a height, and it quit expanding, it generally created environment of peace and also of infrastructural development. The Romans were tremendous road builders, aqueduct builders, and so on. And very similar things happened in Han China, so there's been a lot of comparison. Their populations were similar. They had some similarities in their administrative systems, although some big differences as well. But they both just sort of established this situation of peace and security and infrastructural development, which you would generally think of as enhancing population. But not necessarily, as we'll see later, that actually the Roman population had been expanding before the empire, but once the empire is established, it probably was at a plateau level. So another thing to note, though, is that creating these empires, expanding them, and even maintaining them often involved the massive loss of life. I'll use the example here of the Assyrian Empire. It's sometimes considered to be the first real empire in human history. There were earlier empires, Sargon of Akkad, what was that? I think 2300 BCE, and Mesopotamia had created an empire, but that just involved conquering other people and forcing them to pay tribute. But the Assyrian Empire eventually developed a system of administration throughout this very large area you could see in green on the map, including at its height even Egypt and all of Mesopotamia in a much larger area. And they started to really administer their empire. The figure on the right notes the Assyrians, the appalling lords of torture. And I bring that up, as it says here, impalements, flaying, and amputations were the trademark, and we see this in one of their relief sculptures. And Assyrian emperors really bragged about the number of people they slaughtered. So yes, bring peace once you conquer peoples, but if that conquering involved often just intense bloodshed, massacring of entire populations, and then any rebellion or so would be met the same way. And the same was true of the creation of the Roman Empire, intense bloodshed, and any rebellion like the Jewish rebellion. I mean, the Jews were basically scattered throughout the Mediterranean after their last big rebellion. So it's in terms of demographic patterns, creation of empires cuts both ways, we might say. And also I'd note that some early empires, certainly the Assyrians, and there were others. I mean, the Incas did this in the, well, it's much later, but did that in the Americas. Some of the Chinese dynasties did this. It's just move populations, entire populations. The map shows the captivity of Jewish people taken out of the original Jewish homeland to Assyria and other places. Later, the Persians conquered the Assyrians, and then Jews were allowed to return to their homeland. But it wasn't just the Jews that the Assyrians did this to, and we know from modern cases certainly that expulsions of peoples like this resulted in a tremendous loss of life. And I have a map here from way later. This is the 30 Years' War in Central Europe, 1618 to 1648. But there's good information on the loss of life that war entailed in parts of Germany, over 50%, in large areas over 40%. These are pretty good numbers. And this is not people being killed in battle. This is people being killed by disease or starving. Armies spread disease. They are people crowded together, unsanitary conditions, perfect place for disease to spread, and they'll spread out of the armed forces. And then there were not really good logistics systems for most early armies, exceptions, but most of them fed themselves basically by stealing from the people whose lands they were occupying, and starvation would follow. And also one thing too, as the states develop and spread, and as the world becomes more economically integrated, more long-distance trade, you get the spread of infectious diseases from one area to another. We'll look at this in some detail in the next lecture and the lecture after that on the bubonic plague. But I have the book here, Infectious Diseases Along the Silk Road, the spread of them past and present. Okay, the next topic I want to look at now are the ancient Greeks and the Phoenicians as well. But at the beginning of the Iron Age, Greece was about 1000 BCE. Greece was still in its ancient Dark Age. Like I said, the citadels of the Mycenaean Greeks had been destroyed. These were the people who were sort of remembered by Homer, and Homer was a poet, or a group of poets, as some think, who were originally recounting the times of this earlier civilization through oral poetry, later written down when literacy returned to the Greeks, which is maybe 800 BCE. But the Greek-speaking people didn't have any cities or states at this time, 1000 BCE. But there were Greek-speaking peoples in the region. But then a few hundred years later, the Greeks are starting to expand massively. So from about 800 to 500 BCE, there was this intensive maritime colonization. And the Phoenicians, a Semitic-speaking people from what is now Lebanon, were doing the same thing. In fact, the Phoenicians who brought literacy back to Greece. The Greek alphabet is based on the Phoenician alphabet. The Phoenician alphabet was the first alphabet, a first writing system to replicate not words but sounds. The Greeks added vowels. The Phoenicians didn't mark their vowels. But the Phoenicians spread into the Western Mediterranean, particularly the southern side. The Greeks spread all around the coast. Maps like this are always exaggerated because they were just in coastal areas, well, except in southern Italy and Sicily. But you can see Marseille or Massalia, that was a Greek town. Emporia, that's where we get the word emporium in what is now Spain, all around the Black Sea. Extensive settlement of Greeks. So this would have indicated certainly a rather extreme population expansion or explosion even among Greek-speaking peoples in the Iron Age. And there are some good records of this because it continued for quite a while. Where it continued into the era where there was when literacy had returned, and so we have records of or discussions of a city-state population had become too great, so a colony is established somewhere. This proved very beneficial, though, for the Greeks because it enabled them to expand their trade networks. That became really crucial, and the same with the Phoenicians. The earliest Greek expansion, let's say to the coast of what is today Turkey, or Asia Minor, as it's called. These were the so-called Ionian cities of Greece. They were some of the most important, especially in the early period. It may have been based on a process not of Greeks, men and women moving, but of just Greek men moving and defeating local men, perhaps killing them, enslaving them, or forcing them out, and then enslaving and marrying the local women. And that's what Herodotus, known as the father of history, first historian, geographer, anthropologist, if you will, whose work, the history from the classic era of ancient Greece. Herodotus himself was from Halicarnassus, a city in what is today Turkey, and his description was that no women from Greece were involved in the founding of the Greek colonies of Western Asia Minor. Only the men came and subsequently married Carian women. Carian was the pre-existing language of this region. And it's one thing that's really interesting is the first Greek surge of writing, speculative writing. The map here shows poets, mathematicians, and philosophers and historians before Plato. This is the so-called Ionian Enlightenment, and it basically occurred in what is now Western Turkey, in these Greek-speaking cities that, according to Herodotus anyway, were of mixed origin, and that includes Herodotus himself. Back into Greece proper, by the classical period, there was a tremendous amount of environmental degradation based largely because of population pressure. Plato himself talks about this extensively. Just to quote a little bit of this, he's talking about soil, what remains now as compared with those old days, like the skeleton of a body wasted by disease. The soil or at any rate as much as it is rich and soft, has rolled away, and only the spare body of the land remains. Or below, moreover, the ground benefited from the rain sent each year by Zeus and didn't lose it, but nowadays the water flows off the bare ground and into the sea. So Plato's description is that before, in earlier periods, before the population grew and city-states emerged, soil of Greece was very fertile. Now, he didn't have good information on this. A lot of this is based on legends and oral histories and the like. But it is a very, very common process. This wasting away of the soil of Greece proper, however, did not result in any sort of population collapse or problem, because the Greeks by this time were very much a trade-dependent people. Athens, in particular, we know that by the 4th century BCE was getting its grain from what is now Ukraine. I could go back to this earlier map. So there were these Greek settlements along the Black Sea, and they were bringing in tremendous amounts of grain from the Black Sea, timber for ships and other purposes from the mountains of what is now northern Turkey, even dried fish from the Sea of Azov. That's the smaller sea in the northern part of the Black Sea. And there were these very extensive trade networks, and the Greek city-states could specialize more on higher value crops. Actually, grapes and olives can do quite well in eroded soil. They have roots that can go deep into the subsoil, and you could turn those into much higher value products, wine and olive oil. Greeks exported a lot of pottery and other goods. So even though they had this environmental degradation coincident with population expansion, they were still able to maintain their economies and grow them to quite an extent. And I should also note that this process of population expansion, particularly male population, out of Greece continued with Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE, or the so-called Great. He was a great military leader, but wasn't great at much else. Conquered the Persian Empire and established Greek cities all the way to what is today India. Note, this is just showing the ones named either Alexandria or Alexandropolis, city of Alexander, showing his megalomania. One thing Alexander did after conquering the Persian Empire was to force some 10,000 of his soldiers to marry Persian women. I mean, he really believed in creating this sort of hybrid civilization. But like I say, Greek cities well established even to Central Asia, and they had all the features of a Greek city, temples and theaters and the like. So there was a substantial movement of population. Okay, the last topic I want to take on is the Roman Empire. And there's pretty good information on it. I really like this map. I don't know how accurate it is, but it's showing the cities of the Roman Empire. And even though Empire was only about 10 to 15% urbanized, it really was an urban culture, and the administration all happened through cities. The Romans were actually quite light on administration. The empire had a very small bureaucracy, and Rome itself got taxation money and made sure that the Roman peace was maintained. But empire was basically administrated by the local elites living within the cities, who became Romanized, or if they're in the East, Hellenized, in other words, taking on Greek culture. Culturally, the Roman Empire was quite a synthesis of Roman and Greek cultural features. But you can see cities very widely widespread. It's interesting in the north, often very close to the frontier of the empire, which you could see, which is often the military legions were there. That led to growth of certain urban cores. Rome itself had over 1 million, or probably around 1 million at its height, which was just gargantuan. I mean, Athens at its height was probably maybe 150,000. So Rome was almost an order of magnitude larger. It could only do that because of the ability of the Romans engineers to bring in water and aqueducts and take out sewage, which wasn't treated but was at least taken out of the city, and food and other goods, food particularly from Egypt. And you can see Alexandria in Egypt, second largest city in the empire. So anyway, a very interesting map. We go back to the earliest Roman history. If you look at this map, Roman territory before 300 BC, it's just that purple zone along the coast near Rome. This was essentially the Latin-speaking region, and Romans were to spread their Latin language, of course. So it was a relatively slow process, but you could see before 300 and then by 264, start of the Punic War, a huge expansion covering essentially all the southern two-thirds of Italy. And in this conquest of neighboring peoples in southern Italy, one of the things the Romans did was establish colonies throughout the region. In other words, they would take people from the Latin-speaking core and establish cities for them in strategic locations throughout that southern region of Italy to help them control the region. And to have had this ability to keep establishing these new colonies meant there was surplus population. So almost certainly the population of Latin-speaking peoples, Romans, was expanding greatly in this early period of the Roman Republic. This map also shows Hannibal's route. So Hannibal was a leader from Carthage, which was originally a Phoenician colony. The Phoenicians, another maritime people. The Carthaginians established their own empire, particularly in southern Spain, which was the most mineral-rich mining zone of the Mediterranean world. But as the Romans expanded, the Carthaginians became concerned. They had several Punic Wars. There were three of them. The Second Punic War involved the famous expedition of Hannibal after the Romans had mastered naval fighting, which they didn't even know about, but they mastered it quite quickly. Hannibal had to come overland, bring his famous elephant troops over the Alps. But Hannibal defeated Roman army after army. In the Battle of Cana, he enveloped a Roman army and essentially destroyed it. This kept happening. He thought he had defeated them. He defeated all their armies. But the Romans were able to keep raising new legions. There were enough of a reserve population, enough young men that they could continue to do it and fight and eventually win and totally destroy the Carthaginians. So I mention this because it does indicate that there was this period of enough population expansion for the Romans to do this. And that's still a story that boggles my mind, how this one city-state was able to create this empire of such proportion. But at any rate, all the information we have seems to indicate that the population of the Roman Empire reached a pretty high level by ancient standards, but then reached a kind of plateau with ups and downs over the next few hundred years. So estimates of the size of the empire under Augustus, the first emperor, around the year 0, 50 to 70 million. A couple hundred years later under Marcus Aurelius, 60 to 70. A few hundred years later under Constantine, the first Christian emperor, a little bit lower, but still 50 to 65. There were some ups and downs, as we will see during that period, particularly a big downward movement in the 3rd century of the 200s, but not a situation of population growth. If we can look at some mortality tables, this is real estimates. You can see this comes from Wikipedia, but it's one model possible life table for the Roman Empire. But important to note that all pre-modern societies that maintained themselves had to be characterized by high fertility because they all had high mortality. And the Roman Empire was no exception. So its replacement level fertility was probably around 4.5 to 6.5 children per woman. I mean, consider today 2.1 in an advanced society. I've added a little bit to this life expectancy table only to the female side, where I've given sort of a remaining total life expectancy. So in other words, for age 0, at least according to this model, life expectancy was 25. If you made it to year 1, life expectancy would have been about 36. If you made it to age 20, your total life expectancy would have been a little over 50. And if you made it to 40, it'd be up to 60. So yeah, most deaths were happening in infancy and early childhood, but like even if you made it to 40, you could only expect to live 20 more years. So very, very different from modern life expectancy. It's really important to note how good we have it, how miserable things were in terms of health and life expectancy in the pre-modern world. But anyway, for the Roman Empire, at its height, fertility was almost certainly below replacement level. And this is especially true for the elite, which we know best. But genetic information, other information shows that the Roman Empire was able to maintain its population by immigration into it. Now, some of this was voluntary, some of it was by enslaving people on the frontiers and bringing them in, a most involuntary situation. Roman Empire was had to a very large degree a slave-based economy with enslaved people up to, estimates vary, but up to a third of the population in some periods. Actually, in the Republic was in a way even more of slave-based system, because when it was expanding its territories and conquering other peoples, that invariably brought in huge numbers of enslaved people. Like I say, that we do know a lot about fertility and class in ancient Rome. A little bit of snippet of text from an article on this. But just to quote from an analysis of female skeletons, show that the average number of children born to elite women was less than 2. And these findings support anecdotal evidence from this era that small families and childlessness were becoming common. So that common particularly in urban populations, and particularly for elite populations. And that's where we have the best literary information, almost no literary information otherwise. Certainly there would have been much higher fertility in rural areas in the outskirts of the empire. But all those cities across the empire that were so important to its administration and organization almost certainly did not reach the replacement level fertility, and the empire as a whole probably not either, probably developed on this flow from outside. And to continue from this article, fertility among female slaves was highly prized, as this translated into profit for the slave owner. And here we have from a book on agriculture, the author saying, "I have given exemption from work and sometimes even freedom to very fertile female slaves," because there was just such a desire for a larger workforce. Population had basically sort of plateaued, and there were often labor shortages. So sometimes even enslaved people could benefit from this. Continue here that reward a woman who has produced 3 sons with exemption from work and would manumit a freer entirely if she produced more. But the children would remain enslaved. Roman emperors were certainly worried about low fertility, and they had pro-natal policies. At least some of them did. Augustus, particularly the first emperor and one of the ones who ruled for the longest period of time, one of the most successful, but in 18 BC already found it necessary to pass a law in hopes of raising the birth rate by penalizing the unmarried and the childless. So a lot of Roman elites were not marrying, were not having children, were not having very many children. And so there were a number of these legal efforts to try to encourage or force them to have more children. A lot of speculation has been made about why there was low fertility, why in particularly Roman elite women were not having many children at all. One would be a desire to maintain their family property endowments, not have them be divided up amongst a number of children. Also, elite women were able to engage in contraception and abortion to some degree to reduce their fertility. contraception in particular often favored. Well, one thing to note is just how dangerous childbirth was. A very good chance of women dying in childbirth, and a lot of them wanted to avoid it. Exposure was very common. That simply means letting babies die, infanticide. Sometimes they'd be put at the entrance to a temple, may be taken in or not, but just still going to have very high mortality rates. The high urbanization rate in Rome, with up to 1 million people, very crowded, of course, that would have resulted in more disease and lower chance of survival for children. A lot of speculation about the use of lead pipes in cooking pots, which they certainly did, and lead accumulation in the body leads to a lot of health problems and reduced fertility and increased mortality, decreased health. I have here the use of lead as a sweetener. Well, that will be the next slide. Because the thing with lead pipes is they will have mineral deposits on the inside, which should protect against the lead seeping in, at least to some degree. And the previous article that in the previous slide mentions the possibility of the Romans' love of very hot baths, which may have reduced male fertility. I'm kind of skeptical of this, but it's quite an intriguing point, I suppose you could say. Baths were very important to elite and, well, even urban Romans, citizens in general. So baths, the baths, which often very large, very well organized, various hot pools and colder pools, and a place for socialization and many things other than just cleanliness. But it is known that male sperm motility, is that what they call it, greatly reduced if from very hot baths. I'm skeptical though. But anyway, this thing about lead poisoning, it is now known. We have an article from Smithsonian that lead was used as a sweetener. Bizarre. Lead acetate, known as sugar of lead, is a salt that has a sweet flavor. That's unusual in poisons. But Roman aristocrats used this to sweeten wine. There's definitely evidence of lead poisoning in bones, and lead is bad news, and certainly results in reduced fertility and increased mortality. And it's thought that not just ancient Romans, but others may have succumbed to this. It also tells you how expensive sweeteners were. I mean, they didn't have sugar. Honey was the main sweetener, and it was quite dear. Anyway, back to the population of Rome. Ancient Rome did have several very severe epidemics, plagues called here, but that does not mean the bubonic plague. The first was the Antonine plague. This was called that because it happened during the reign of Marcus. It started with anyway, sorry, lost my train of thought. It reached its height under the reign of Marcus Aurelius, which ended, I believe, in 180. This is often considered sort of the high point of the Roman Empire and then decline afterwards. We don't know what this plague was. Some say smallpox. There's no genetic evidence. But it's thought that it resulted in a 10 to 15% population reduction, which is not huge, but focused on the cities, which were super important, and the army, which was essential. Of course, army always a good place for diseases to spread. So it's sometimes thought that this resulted sort of in the end of Rome's great period and the beginning of decline. It's hard to say. It seems a little too early. But we do know that in the 3rd century, or the 200s AD, the Roman Empire almost collapsed. From about 230 to 270, it was really just sort of a shambles of an empire. There were rival empires in what had been Roman territory were established. There was political chaos. Most emperors were assassinated. There were some of the first so-called barbarian invasions of Germanic peoples. Currency was debased. Trade declined. Cities declined. Population declined. So many people thought the Roman Empire was done for. Now it recovered late 200s, 300s, but it was never quite as strong as it had been. Its economic base wasn't nearly as strong. During this terrible century, there was another pandemic, the plague of Cyprian. Another 20% population reduction. Again, we don't know what it was. Smallpox, measles. Some of it suggested viral hemorrhagic fever like Ebola. These sort of things generally are not hyper-communicable, but very high death rates. Another suggestion has been climate. This almost always comes up. This is a fascinating graph from The Economist showing hypothesized rainfall in central Italy. Evidence of a pretty pronounced decline, and agriculture in Italy based on rainfall, not much in the way of irrigation at this time. Reduced rainfall, reduced harvest. Now, of course, Rome itself could get the grain from Egypt, but outside of Rome it was a different matter. And you could see this huge surge of assassinations of Roman emperors, something like 3 a year. Very short life expectancy of an emperor at this time because it was sort of a situation of political collapse. Although the collapse didn't happen, rainfall greatly increased later on in the 300s or the 4th century, and the Roman Empire was reestablished. I'll talk about that a little bit later on. There was also a cooler climate at this time. The lower rainfall was associated with cooling. So you could see from this graph of hypothesized temperature, Roman warming was occurring as the Roman Republic was expanding its empire. It wasn't technically an empire, but it effectively was an empire as it conquered other peoples. And then a real decline for this 3rd century crisis. Last thing I want to discuss is whether the Christianization of the Roman Empire, which happened in the 300s or the 4th century, would have resulted in a higher fertility rate. Certainly there was a population recovery at this time. That recovery may have been mostly because of improved climatic conditions, warmer, which is really important for areas north of the Alps, and more rain, more important for Mediterranean areas. But there was a population rebound, and the 4th century of the 300s was the time of the triumph of Christianity. At the beginning of the century, Christians were still being persecuted. Then Constantine converts. He didn't actually get baptized till his deathbed, but he encouraged Christianity much earlier. By the end of the century, the pagan religions, the previous religions, were essentially outlawed under Emperor Theodosius, and it was a Christian empire. But it has been suggested by a number of scholars, and I've read this many places, but I looked through my library, I couldn't find the actual text, so I had the expedient of asking ChatGPT. Well, because ChatGPT is not great by any means, but it often gives a consensus view. It says, yes, the evidence suggests that Christians in the Roman Empire had higher fertility rates than their pagan counterparts. This demographic trend is often cited as one factor for contributing to the growth of Christianity. So even before Christianity became accepted, Christians may have had much higher birth rates. And then after the empire as a whole becomes Christianized, then that would have expanded those higher birth rates. So some of the possible reasons. One is Christian attitudes towards marriage and family. So for early Christians, the ideal state of life was to be celibate from a spiritual perspective, to be a celibate monk for a man. Certainly bishops had to be celibate. Priests didn't. That didn't happen until the Middle Ages. But certainly people higher in the church had to have it. But for the most people, the Christian ideal was to marry and have children, and for sexual activities to be restricted to within marriage and for procreation. So the Christians were very much against contraception, abortion, certainly exposure of infants, which had been very common. They also encouraged earlier marriage, often quite late marriage for Roman men in particular. It has been suggested, and I have no idea how relevant this is, but differences in sexual mortality and fewer sexually transmitted diseases. Now, there was no syphilis. That came from the Americas almost certainly, but there was gonorrhea, herpes, other sexually transmitted diseases, which not only have health problems, but also can greatly reduce fertility, both in men and women, from scarring and the like. So if you have a religion that really seeks to, and does it to a certain extent, succeeds at to a certain extent, restricting sexual behavior to sexual activities with other people to the confines of marriage, that can greatly reduce the transmission of sexually transmitted diseases and increase fertility. It's even been suggested that Christians were more devoted to care for the infirm and the sick. That's debated, but it's often been suggested. The final slide I'm going to have here is some controversial interpretation, though. But point I want to make with it is that not just Christianity, but other, what are sometimes called universalizing religions that greatly expanded in the ancient world and the medieval world, and I'm talking about Islam and Buddhism mostly, but we can see similar things as Hinduism developed, and in other religions like Jainism or Sikhism, or even in philosophies like Confucianism, or which has religious aspects, which were to certainly spread and expand greatly in the late ancient world through the medieval period. All of them had sort of similar views on sexuality, of trying to constrain it, obviously not entirely, and more successfully for women's sexuality than for men's. But promiscuity very much disfavored by all of these religions. So it has been suggested, and again, I'm not saying this is true, I'm just saying it's one interpretation, is that one reason for the great expansion of these faiths, be it Islam or Buddhism or Christianity or whatever, is that by restricting sexuality, limiting it, decreasing promiscuity and the like, that would have increased fertility rate and the possibility of growth. So this final slide, which I'm not certain whether it's wise to show or not, has the issue of temple prostitution in the ancient world. So good evidence that in the ancient Near East, before the spread of Christianity and Judaism in some areas, and later Islam, but before that happened, there had actually been prostitution was ritualized itself. So temples to Isis or other goddesses were centers of this sort of sacred prostitution. To the extent that this was very widespread, it probably resulted in a lot of spread of venereal disease. There's not a lot of great evidence for this, but it does indicate this very different attitude towards sexuality that had been present before the spread of these universalizing religions. As I say, there's some controversy. Some modern scholars say that this temple prostitution has been greatly exaggerated. It wasn't that widespread. I think partly that's because there's a lot of objections to the fact that it occurred, and I suspect that it was fairly widespread, and I think it may have played a role. Who knows? I do find it interesting. Okay, that's all I have for today. The next lecture is going to look at demography in what sometimes called late antiquity, 400s, 500s, on through to the beginning of the Middle Ages. That will probably be a fairly short lecture, and I'll have a longer lecture on medieval patterns. And I'll look at other parts of the world. I know this lecture today was mostly focused on the Middle East, Near East, Mediterranean world. Partly that's because we have better information from that, but it is important to bring in other parts of the world, and I will strive to do that. So thank you for listening, and I hope you can tune into other lectures in this series.